Good morning, all. We are about to start our BTS Spark Summer Series webinar, which is our inaugural webinar that we've been planning and running out of BTS Spark, and I think you'll enjoy this first webinar, which is on well-being. This webinar series that we've developed is really looking at educational leadership, and so getting experts and practitioners and school leaders in to discuss some current and key issues. And the first one that we have today, with some rather noteworthy speakers as well, is focusing on well-being. As many of us know and have experienced over the last 12 months, well-being is becoming not only more critical in education, but it's also becoming more critical across our communities and our schools as well. You can also see that we have some additional webinars coming up. At the end of this month, we are focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And August 2nd, we're focusing on messy leadership. For those who don't know, a quick introduction. I'm Sean Slade. I'm the co-head of education at BTS Spark for North America, sharing the role with Alyssa Gallagher, who's based over in LA as well. Some quick logistical items. We are using the Zoom platform, and as you can see, we're trying to make it a little bit more interesting and interactive. So what we have are PowerPoint slides that will guide the discussion, hopefully not obstruct the discussion, but as attendees to this webinar, you are actually able to increase the size of your video box, and you are also able to change the way you view that once the speakers come onto their videos. So this way you have a bit of a range on what you can do, but we also have the slides so we can talk about some of the quotes that we have, but also see what questions we're discussing. There will hopefully be time at the very end for some Q&A, so please submit your questions into the Q&A box, and there will also be an ongoing chat that Alyssa Gallagher will be monitoring. So if you have questions or reactions, please enter those into the chat box. So as mentioned, this is really focusing on well-being, an issue that's fairly key and core to my heart. I do think it's fairly foundational in the human endeavor of education, but this year has really changed the way that we look at it, or changed the way that we appreciate it. So the question really becomes, starting off, is why well-being? Why are we focusing on well-being? And I'd like to share a couple of quotes that we have that I think would highlight, although I think, to be honest, we could probably ask both the attendees and the panelists about why well-being is key over this last year, and we could have got some similar answers. EdWeek put out an article recently called "Should We Be Concerned About the Mental Health of Principals?" And it's something that we realize when we're in these roles, that school leaders are seen as the boss, the administrator, the person in charge. They're consistently offering up support to help their teachers, their students, and the rest of their school communities. And the issue that we experienced around COVID was that very often there was no correct answer to the questions they were being asked. In the same article, it talked about how there are 42% of principals thinking of leaving the profession. In a typical year, it's around the 20% mark. And often some of those schools that are in the hardest hit areas, or the most marginalized, underserved communities, are the ones that are suffering the most. And that's where you're also finding principals suffering the most. And this isn't just a US phenomenon. It's not even a North American phenomenon. This comes from the Canadian press, talking about how 50%, 57% of those surveyed from virtual schools reported that their levels of stress were not manageable. And even when you look at those schools that are focused on in-person or hybrid over the last 12 months, 49% are finding the stress unmanageable. And unfortunately, this is not something that's focused only on principals. This was another EdWeek article focused on the mass exodus of superintendents, and a quote from Dan Domenech from the School Superintendents Association. It's a combination of stress and a no-win situation. I added this slide just yesterday, but we've had in the US, the superintendents in 3 of the largest school districts step down recently. And these were the headlines. New York City school chancellor resigns after enduring heavy pandemic losses. LA superintendent steps down after managing through pandemic. Chicago CEO resignation follows a tough year managing COVID. We've experienced one of the most stressful and unusual years in education. And as we know, it also affects the students and it also affects the educators. You know, they've been anxious for months in this EdSurge article, but fearlessly been forging ahead into uncharted and unnecessary territory. And despite exhaustion, they've continued to work tirelessly, transforming kitchen tables into classrooms, becoming the cafeteria, technology, custodial, counselling staff for their own children. And this article I'm going to come back to a couple of times during this session or this webinar, because very often when we talk about stress relief or mental health with our educators or with our principals, we automatically think of mindfulness activities or yoga or taking time off, or as they say in this article from Educational Leadership, when Netflix isn't enough. And the truth is that none of these practices really provide true recovery. They provide temporary recovery. And until schools fully attend to adult social emotional needs, parallel to those of the students, not ignoring the students, educators will continue to engage in superficial recharge activities and turnover will persist. But there is hope. You know, I think most of us in education are optimistic, glass half full. Research from Microsoft Education in their Education Reimagined piece talks about districts that have actually survived and to a certain extent thrived during the pandemic. Fresno Unified in California is a good example. They've had a lot of focus on agency, a lot of focus on decision making, a lot of focus on well-being. And they sum up, as the world faces this unparalleled challenge, the critical role the schools play in supporting the health and well-being of learners, and in fact, the whole school community, is becoming paramount. So I suppose in a way, this conversation is both about why well-being, but it's also about how well-being, how we start to make these changes, how we start to put well-being front and center. I'm going to ask the panelists to turn on their cameras at the moment so you can start to see their wonderful true-to-life images as I introduce them, and then we're going to launch into some discussions. I'm also going to ask the panelists as I introduce them just to turn on their microphones, and if they don't mind, to keep them on, because what we're trying to engage in here is hopefully a discussion. Many of these people don't need long-winded introductions. Andy Hargreaves is one of those. He's the director of, how do we pronounce that, Andy? Chanine, Change, Engagement and Innovation in Education at the University of Ottawa. But Andy is also a well-known speaker, author, frequent author with Dennis Shirley as well. And he has been a recent advisor in education to the Premier of Ontario and currently the First Minister of Scotland, as well as a founder of ARC Education, the Atlantic Rim Collaboratory, I believe. So welcome, Andy.
Hello.
We also have Dennis Shirley, who also comes from the Boston College Lynch School of Education, where he is the Dugan Faculty Fellow and Professor. And he's written many books, several with Andy as well, which I think many people on this webinar would probably know. And besides delivering addresses on 6 continents, I'm curious which ones are missing, Dennis?
It's the unpopulated one. It's at Antarctica.
Okay, all right, we'll leave that one for another day. But you're hitting the main 6. And one thing that's not on bio is he's fluent in Italian and a lover of Italian culture. A place where Dennis and I meet up occasionally, or at least philosophically. So good morning, Dennis. We also have Tara O'Brien, and Tara O'Brien is a founding partner with BTS Spark. She's been around since the beginning of this work. And she's co-authored articles on the power of coaching, supporting educational leader wellness, and on the attributes of messy leadership, which is a topic we'll be discussing in August. But Tara has been instrumental in not only planning, but also launching some of our wellness initiatives with EdCan and across Canada. So welcome, Tara.
Morning.
And it is morning for most of these people, at least for 2 of these people, because they're more over on the West Coast. And Josh Garcia, although he does have a habit of getting up at about 6 in the morning anyway. Josh Garcia has been the Deputy Superintendent over in Tacoma Schools in Washington, just outside Seattle. He's been a long-time advocate of progressive education and whole child education, and really developing the supports of the community to help schools and for schools to help the community. And Josh is about to start a new role as Superintendent of Tacoma Schools in Washington. So good morning, Josh, as well.
Morning, all.
So as I mentioned, I'm posing these questions to people, and would like them to answer first, but we're then going to, if people want to react on the panel, you're more than welcome to. So the first question is going to Andy and Dennis. And this gives you a guide of what we're trying to find out about. That the pandemic has definitely brought these issues to the fore around well-being. But is mental health, stress, well-being, that new of a concern in education?
Andy, do you want to get us started there? Turn on your voice.
Yeah, welcome everybody from all parts of the US, Canada, and beyond, wherever you are. We'd love to be with you in person, but we're all learning to live this Zoom life in different ways, and to try and be well at the same time as we're doing it. So the pandemic, I think, Sean, as you say, has been utterly extraordinary, and it's turned many things upside down. So who would have believed 2 years ago, when many countries were still thinking about austerity, that now we would have a global agreement on minimal corporate taxation, so that billions of dollars can be raised, including from big tech companies worldwide, to go into public education and all the things that public education needs. Who would have thought 2 years ago that instead of thinking technology was the answer to everything, and blended learning was the answer, and learning remotely and not having teachers and not having walls, that now we'd be thinking entirely the opposite, because we've seen how much children, their families have struggled with getting access to machinery, with switching on, with engaging emotionally online, because they heart of the teaching, the heart of learning is not an interaction between a child and an algorithm. It's not an interaction between a child and a target, a child and a test score, a child and a machine, a child even on a rubric written in the language of a refrigerator repair manual, although that's unfair actually to the authors of refrigerator repair manuals. The heart of the learning relationship is a human interaction in most cases between a child, a young person, and a teacher, and a child and other children. We've seen during the pandemic how many children have been disengaged, not only from their learning, but disengaged from their peers, from their communities. We know now how important physical schools are, physical buildings, because they don't only develop literacy and mathematics, though they do that, but they also develop young people as human beings. And we've learned, particularly in a very exaggerated way during this pandemic, that if children aren't there, they can't learn. If children are worried, anxious, hungry, abused, worrying where their next support, their next meal will come from, disconnected from their friends, not able to talk about who they are and where they're going. It's very difficult for them to engage with their learning. Engagement is the secret to achievement in the vast majority of cases, and there is no engagement or little engagement that lasts without well-being. And I think we've learned a lot about well-being at the base of Maslow's needs hierarchy. Many people now say Maslow comes before Bloom, safety, shelter, security. In the middle, we'd also add belonging. We're realizing just how important our belonging is and how hard it is to maintain any sense of that in a virtual distanced learning environment. And now with all that we've learned from this, we must also take care of those things and keep moving up the hierarchy that Maslow talked about into thriving, into flourishing, into enjoying and loving school. So when people come back to school, they're not just engaging in extra hours to mug up on the literacy and mug up on the maths, much as important as that is, but that they're re-engaging with the excitement of school, the excitement of learning, the excitement of developing as young people, and eventually into that stage that Maslow talked about late on in his career, which is self-transcendence. That's come to feel part of something that is even bigger than you, which might be religious, which might be nature, which might be just the whole society, the whole community. So we've suffered a lot, all of us, some much more than others, but we're also learning a lot, and we must really build upon what we're learning, not just to recover, but to remember and renew what is truly always important in young people's development and in our schools.
Yeah, it's my fear with the reopening of schools in the next school year is that there will be this knee-jerk shift to address learning loss, which should be targeted, but not at the expense of what we've learned about well-being. Dennis, yourself and Andy have been writing a book for ASTD on well-being, which I believe is coming out end of the year. A quick summary of that, some of your findings would be interesting, but also just answering that second question of whether we've ignored well-being too long in education.
Right, thank you for the question, Sean. So Andy and I did some kind of an archaeological dig, and we went back and we found out that the term well-being really became common with the creation of the World Health Organization right after the Second World War. And that was the organization that really started advocating for social workers and counselors in schools and in society much more, and contributed to the growth of those sectors of our profession. I think that for Andy and me, because we have in addition to the ASCD book, we have a book coming out the day after tomorrow called 5 Paths of Student Engagement. We try to understand what are the things that are going on in the schools that teachers can address with appropriate interventions. So things like yoga, meditation, group activities, innovative teaching, and what are the things that really need to change in how we design our schools and how we design our learning. So right now, what's happening all over the US is that the arch enemy of student engagement has come back. It's the Darth Vader or Lord Voldemort of student disengagement, really, and that is standardized testing. So imaginating what could possibly be more alienating than you finally make it back to your school after this horrific pandemic. And one of the first things that greets you is a standardized test. When there's such deep human needs for connection, for recuperation, for learning something really substantial. I just want to say one thing about this before I close here, Sean, which is that we want to get to well-being, but that doesn't mean that we have to be superficial about it. So the program Facing History and Ourselves studies the Holocaust, the Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade, lots of gruesome parts of human history, but then carefully scaffolds the learning so that students are paying attention to what's going on in their environment and end up feeling empowered, end up feeling like agents of their own lives. So I think that well-being doesn't have to just be playing in a wading pool of emotional gobbledygook. It can help our young people and ourselves in the profession to deal with the more troubling aspects of the human condition and also to get empowered to address those.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think it harks back to your talk about things being superficial. We run the risk, even in well-intentioned districts as well, of providing a superficial Netflix approach a la that article, and not actually getting down to what's actually causing the stress and what can we do about it in our schools and systems. So before I introduce or lead a question to Josh, I'll open up the last question to anybody who wants to chime in. But, you know, what's caused this new sudden realization that well-being is critical to education? And I'll add on to that, do we think this has longevity? Do we think this is going to continue past the start of the next school year?
Sean, I mean, it's almost 9 o'clock on the West Coast. How polarizing do you want the panel?
You can say whatever you want to, Josh. That's why you're on the panel.
All right, a few things to consider for us. I agree with everything that was said, but I also would just offer some other things for us to consider. Is that when I think the pandemic surfaced in the modern media that has been well known by a lot of our underserved populations, is that well-being for a lot of students has never been a priority by the institutions of education. And the pandemic served and made it a crisis for white middle-class families that saw that their kids were struggling. But the energy wasn't as needed as that we, as Dennis mentioned, it's been historical, that is needed forever. And I hope that this changes our trajectory. But lessons would be in history would say that once we're through the pandemic, we would go back to, if we feel okay, meaning who's we, those that are white and middle class. I'm not. The whole educator, the whole child approach is not new. It's not a new concept, but sometimes it takes a crisis to bring it to this level for all of us. The other thing that I would just say and offer is that kids and adults have been learning outside of schools forever. I oftentimes will say that we have them for a third of the time and the community has them for 2/3 of the time. I think what the pandemic has surfaced is and exposed is that kids are going to continue to learn. I really appreciate your conversation or comment, Sean, about maybe it's not learning loss. I just don't think, to Dennis's point around standardized tests, we've found a way to harness the assessment of the valuable learning that's been happening in schools and out schools in a more holistic manner. And so I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, points well taken. And I think that the idea as well that there are things that we need to assess. The issue about, and I agree about how even my own kids have learnt a lot of self-agency, direction, self-efficacy over this time period, not to mention resilience and perseverance. But again, until we systemize what we're trying to develop and what we're trying to teach and how we assess it, these things are going to happen for certain students, and other students are going to end up suffering or not gaining from these out of school hour, teaching experiences. Well, since I have you on the microphone, Josh, let me move to the next question as well and keep this moving along. So, maybe it's good as well at the very start just to outline Tacoma schools in Washington, describe the setting, the community, and as really the only school leader who is currently in a position at a district on this panel, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the stresses that you've witnessed or seen in Tacoma as well.
So I have the great privilege and honor to serve in Tacoma, Washington. Tacoma, Washington's a port city on the left coast of the United States. We oftentimes say we're in the real right Washington. No offense to all you DC folks, but we're the left end of the coast and the upper. As a port community, we have a rich history of diversity and historical injustices, economically, politically, you name it. We serve students that have approximately, I think, anywhere from around 80 different languages. We're a school district pre-pandemic with our preschools. We were about 30,000. We've lost students during this time. We are both ethnically diverse as well as a variety of languages, gender identifications, you name it. And so it's really a great place to be. Has COVID increased the stress in Tacoma? Absolutely. Absolutely. Kids have always had stresses, right? Kids have always had stresses. Adults have always had stresses. I think the unsettling effect of COVID is not knowing if you're going to bring something home that is going to put a family member's life in danger. And that was felt by a variety of folks, educators, right? So working and serving with kids, the fear of knowing that I may be exposed to something that puts my family at risk, and not at risk from just a saying, but actually life and death. Mm-hmm. And that trauma of what that means for the adults as well as the children was real and palatable, and it still is today. And we can't dismiss that. I would say that that's not the only stress that has happened during this time. Dennis and I were having a little fun exchange, at least in my opinion, around some of the other stresses. During this time, the world, rightfully so, has been dealing with a number of racial injustices. These aren't new, but police brutality is unfortunately hit our community. Just one blow after another was surfaced and put in people's faces. In the United States, some may have forgotten, but we just went through a pretty intense political election and divisive. those are all things that added to the stress. And so the magnification of the stress in Tacoma is still very difficult to deal with. And we saw that in kids. We saw that in the educators. And then my last comment to that is this: educators went through this experience of your profession, a mourning experience that I'm not, my call to action is to serve kids in a face-to-face. And when that's taken away from folks, that's a traumatic experience. And I don't think it was given enough awareness globally that that's part of what educators were going through.
Yeah, and the way they actually had to pivot as well, when I think back to what was happening just over a year ago, literally in the space of, in some schools, 3 or 4 days, they went from closing the schools down to launching virtual learning. And it was an amazing turnaround. Yeah, they got it better and more interactive by the fall, but the ability for teachers and educators and school leaders to adjust quickly was really amazing. Launch into the second question a little bit. So I'm just curious if there's been things that you've experienced or that you've seen or that Tacoma's have been able to launch, which has either been targeting well-being of educators and school leaders, or that's been successful.
Yeah, so when I saw that question, I really kind of it made me pause, right? Because first and foremost, I think we have to all recognize that well-being is grounded in evidence-based practices, but is also a very personal experience for each individual, and it's very dynamic. It's not a set standard where you're automatically well-being and then you're well-being forever, right? It's a very dynamic environment and something that you're constantly having to work through. And then you take that and the diversity of all the constituents that you're trying to work with. We haven't even talked about like partners that work with kids and neighborhoods that work with kids that have all dealing with these traumatic experiences in there. We have had 2 what we call movements that we have been working on for years. The whole educator movement, which is about creating well-being within our educators. And then our whole child movement. We have a wonderful team, small but mighty. Laura Allen, Misty, Rayanne, and Christy, shout out, and then whole educator teams to them. And they have been working with this idea of there are pillars to a whole educator movement. And why that's so critical is we're working with our staff to provide those supports. Well, the staff are really reflective people, right? So they're learning as they're going in this. So what are they learning? They're learning both SEL practices. They're learning trauma-informed practices. They're learning restorative justice practices, advanced tiers of support, continuous improvement, this idea that we're always trying to get better and better. Have they been successful? They've helped us be in a better place for COVID, and hopefully will help us be in a place to recover faster. But we're still in pain. We still have suffering. Yeah. It's still real. People have died. Kids have died. It hasn't removed the scars of injustices. We have human trafficking in our schools. That's not new to COVID. That's trauma. That's real. We have all these other things that are going inside, homelessness, a variety of other challenges. Kids are learning in spite of that. We just have to find better ways to support that learning and remove some of those barriers.
Exactly. Well, Tara, let me bring you into the conversation now, because you have had success in launching programs with Education Canada and also with Surrey schools in British Columbia. So maybe a nice outline to follow on from what Josh was talking about was what was the critical point or the ask that both Surrey schools and EdCam were seeking, and then if you can just summarize or outline some of the things that you've been able to implement in those with those 2 organizations, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And Josh's conversation was the perfect segue in the fact that well-being is so personal. And I think that's one of the things that the school district, Surrey Schools up in Canada, quickly identified. So we had been talking with them about, developing leadership tracks in a much more sort of academic way of how do you develop leadership, and using coaching as a way to get into that personal development around leadership. And the pandemic hit. And their superintendent quickly recognized that their teachers, his principals, assistant superintendents were all going to step up and get the job done, right? They were going to support the kids. But the toll that it was going to take on them was clearly emerging. The stress was going up. The comments of I'm tired, or I'm not sure if I'm going to do this, right? Like, he was seeing breaking points happen pretty quickly and early on, just within the first couple of months, with that rapid adjustment to the disruption. And all of the traditional forms of support were gone. You couldn't meet face to face. You couldn't have a coffee to just check in. I mean, everything was just completely disrupted. And through our conversation and the work that we do at BTS Spark, we knew that there was a set of mindsets that really sit behind well-being that are different for everyone, but they are those things around what you're telling yourself, that internal self-talk. Where is the tension coming from? How do you manage this on a real personal level? And so what we had initially put together, he knew that like adding something in that spring was going to be potentially too intense. So we waited for the summer and we put together a summer well-being program. Lasted a month. It had a combination of group coaching and individual coaching to address things like isolation. Principals were feeling incredibly isolated because they went from at least having their school to being all by themselves, as the lone leader, as well as vice principals feeling like, where's my cohort? Where are my people? Am I the only one going through this? Right? There was definitely a feel of like, am I the only one that's, putting my head down on my pillow every night, just exhausted or crying or not sure if I can, do this work. And what these group coaching moments did was allow for a space and a really candid, really safe and protected space to have some interesting conversations around what was going on for them, but not just a space to like vent, right? It was supported then by a coach of how do we get you through this? How do we build your resiliency toolkit? How do you as an individual continue to show up knowing that there's going to be uncertainty now for, we don't know. That's what uncertainty is. And initially he was a little skeptical, how many people are going to want to work over the summer? Gosh, we just had this intense spring. And we said, we'll just offer it, see what happens. And 85 people out of his district signed up for this summer program. So it really tapped into this need of, I need some additional support, something that looked different. And after the program ran, we got some really great results around some survey data we did. And we asked them questions around, how do you feel about balance? And people shifted from saying, what was one of the statistics? 44% of the participants said, I'm not really sure how to put balance in my life. And by the end of the program, that was up to 90%, knew and understood what balance meant. 64% felt that they didn't know how to stay resilient or be effective in their role during uncertainty and stressful situations. At the end of the coaching program, 100% felt that they had those strategies. 30% weren't sure how to manage some of those energy sapping relationships. That's part of well-being as a leader, right? You have to show up for other people. And we naturally are givers, but how do you not give your whole self away to the point where you have nothing left? And by the end of this coaching program, 100% felt that they had more resources and tools to be able to manage those relationships. And so you can see here in this moment, right, that having a coach that wasn't their boss, wasn't somebody who was going to write this up in a report, it didn't affect their employment, it was truly pure investment in them as an individual, had tremendous success on their perception of their own individual wellness. That then rolled into moving into one-on-one coaching in the fall. They extended it because they still couldn't get back together. The schools still weren't open. And from there, what they've noticed, and this is sort of moving in as in the following years, is that this piece around coaching is supporting their school leaders in all sorts of areas. Now they're working on people who are new to role, getting some coaching. What does it mean to be a new leader and to step into those roles? So rather than being reactive in terms of you're unwell, they're now being proactive in terms of we know that these are potentially stressful situations. So we're going to provide you with some coaching around whether it's your well-being, or is it your leadership skills, or is it your conversation skills, whatever it is. Let's not assume anything and put you in a position with a professional coach. This work then bloomed out into a conversation with Education Canada, EdCan, who had already been working on some wonderful wellness programs throughout Canada. And there was a nice match there around how do we let schools know that this type of resource is available, and how do we help them bring wellness into their schools on multiple levels. So personal coaching with us, and then they have programs around some larger systemic shifts that schools can make on a higher district level. And that partnership has been really lovely. And what we've been able to create with them are things around individual coaching or group coaching, the same sort of how do we get people direct support, but also in things of how do you train people up in your own organizations? How do you bring wellness in rather than just this extra piece or another add-on, but embed it in culture, right? So wellness is an idea of culture rather than wellness as, you know, Wednesday's yoga class, like we sort of talked about, or I'm just going to cancel the meeting because everybody seems stressed, but truly wellness embedded in culture. And that's a lot of the work we're doing with EdCan and understanding the dynamics that are going on in those different schools, like the US. We've got rural schools, we've got schools who are grappling with different racial tensions and socioeconomic disparities, and a virtual program that can unite people, doesn't cost anything to travel, right? Is really responsive to individual needs and individual district needs, is fitting the bill more so than a one-size-fits-all approach to wellness.
Yeah, exactly. I jot down notes as people speak, and it's clear to me and it's outstanding work you've done in Canada as well around this, but it's also what I can hear you saying is it's starting to change the mindsets of school leaders. And one of the mindsets that we're battling is that I need to be not only a servant leader, but I need to give everything away to everybody else. And I'm the last person I take care of. And shifting that mindset in having school leaders understand that they have to take care of themselves is crucial to their school culture. And then the other relates back to what Andy was talking about earlier on, is this mindset shift that education is a human endeavor. You know, it's all about relationships. It's the relationships between the teacher and the student, but it's also the relationships between that school leader and the teachers, and that school leader and their community, and that school leader and other school leaders as well. So yeah, compliments to you, and compliments also to Surrey and EdCan as well in not only seeing the need, but also tackling that as well. Before I launch into sort of the last or the general question for everybody, are there things, and this is open to anybody, are there things that you've seen or things that you believe that schools and school districts should be focusing on now in order to either change the mindsets that we've been talking about, or to actually provide some of these supports for these people who are in positions which are sometimes the loneliest as well? So I'll open that up to anybody.
I have definitely. Oh, go ahead, please, Andy.
I'll just come in quickly. It's something I posted on the chat here. I really just to support and expand on the wonderful stuff that Tara's been talking about, and that is I'm an advisor for Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, and I'm not the only one. There's a group of us, and they, as a result of our advice on these kinds of issues, they're very much that they're an evidence-driven government. So first of all, they take belonging very seriously at the highest level of policy. They have a COVID education recovery group that meets regularly, teacher unions, government leaders, community members, other partners as well. and they've constantly tried to figure out together, and health professionals, what is the best evidence. It's not cast iron. What's their judgment together collectively that they all then own on the basis of that evidence. Make that judgment transparently. When you make a mistake, and you will, because we're in such a volatile situation, apologize for it, and then move on and try and do better next time. And one of the things they learned from this advice and our connection with different countries is the value of having a coach. So they've then offered every principal has been offered a coach during the pandemic to talk about anything at all that can help them. So I think here's the idea of where we connect two things that have come up in the Q&A. One is, belonging isn't just kind of rah-rah, feeling part of a group. It's about being acknowledged, being known, being heard, being included. And there are all kinds of ways to do that. And then actually embedding that in a particular strategy, the kind that Tara's connected with, so that this offer there is available for every leader. Because one of my favorite books is Manuel Ketz de Vries, a Dutch professor, The Leader on the Couch, about the psychiatry of leadership. And he says, if the leader's a mess, you can be sure as hell pretty much everybody else is going to be. So you've got to take care of that.
Well, it's the crazy thing. We talk about school culture in a school building. It does come down from the principal. And so if the principal is under stress and the principal is anxious, then you can guarantee that is going to evoke or spread through the school. And the same thing will happen with a district and a superintendent. No pressure on you, of course, Josh.
I appreciate that. I think that, what we're articulating is everything is connected to everything, right? That, school's not operating in isolation. That was a question around in the chat around community. I think that's an important conversation to have. We've, in our whole child approach, thought of 4 shifts and how they're connected. What's happening in the schools, what's happening with our community-based organizations that are working with kids in after school, in the after school environment. How are we promoting and talking about these things? What's happening with our families? Kids are learning from their families. And what's happening in the greater neighborhood, right? Or in the greater community. And so communities definitely play a role in well-being in there. I want to unpack this a little bit around this idea of what we've learned and what I hope. I think what we've learned is mental health is an important factor for all of us. And I think COVID has really surfaced what that means for us. And I hope that allows us to unpack a stigma that is really, I think, paralyzing on educators. I mean, let's talk about this for a second, right? A superintendent, are they really allowed to say, I'm in a dark place, I'm depressed? I mean, that has ripple effects when you think of media and a variety of, and a classroom teacher. How does a classroom teacher even say to their community, look, I'm really going through a really dark time in my life? The implications are so detrimental still. And I think it's something that we are going to have to continue to surface this idea of mental health and mental health practices. And then, this idea of coaching and support, how do we advocate for funding for that? There's so much continued pressure on limited resources that we're in a traditional manner of looking like we're going to only provide funding for professional development here, but we all surface that the biggest piece is the human experience is the biggest factor in there. And then I think educators are going to have to be very humble to realize that you are not experts in mental health. And so those coaches, if we're trying to change the product of the human being, we then have to then surface, and it's all over, right? The top performing masters of any field have coaching available to them, but it's not oftentimes coaching to their craft. It's coaching to their brain and their mental health and their mental well-being. And we as educators are going to have to admit and be humbled enough to say, we probably need some coaching from a very diverse experience. And then, you know, we're fortunate we have these wonderful leaders that are, the Dennises and the Andys are not just studying the field of education, they're studying broad practices that are giving this. But I really think that we're going to need to limit, or at least embrace, our limitations in the field of education if we're really going to pivot and say we are going to be a field of well-being. And that's also to be in a safe place to say, we maybe are not all where we need to be today, and that's okay.
Yeah, I just picking up on a couple of things you mentioned as well, and I think Tara highlighted these as well, is I think there is some strength in having people come in who are not part of the school district, and you do have that anonymity to be a little bit more open. I also think, and maybe Tara, you know, correct me if I'm wrong as well, is I also get the sense that rather than waiting for school leaders to seek out coaching or seek out support, it's far more beneficial if something is offered to teachers or to educators, and also offered, like you were saying, in more of a pod or a small group environment. So they're also building up a little bit of a support network in their community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things around coaching in particular is that it's not just for mental health, and it's not just for people who are suffering. I think coaching, in my mind, should be seen as a best practice in education. We are, as leaders, right, we're dealing with, you know, with big budgets and lots of people. And in my mind, one of the most important things, the lives of our students. And so why wouldn't we see this as a best practice around having somebody solely dedicated in your corner to help you with whatever is going on? And if that means you are struggling, great. But then if that also means you're being incredibly strategic and you're trying to lead new initiatives, fantastic, because in that leadership piece, you're going to need to bring people with you, and some struggle with those skills. What happens when you get a resistant stakeholder? How do those things happen? And so seeing coaching as an investment and as a best practice in education, rather than something we just pull in when somebody's suffering. It also serves that purpose. But if we just are working on the mindset of, we are exceptional people, we're professionals in our field, as Josh said, right? You look at any professional out there, whether it's athlete or CEO, they all have coaches. It's just expected. And if they don't, people kind of look at them like, why don't you get one? Well, why isn't that in the world of education? We're all professionals. We all have, you know, degrees and experience. We're leading massive organizations. It should just be expected. Of course you have a coach. Why wouldn't you? That's what exceptional people do.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Tara, because it is about a culture, right? I mean, I had my coaching conversation with my coach at 7:30 this morning prior to this meeting. The questions are, you know, what do you know about yourself? What are your limitations? What are you seeing? I mean, it's helping there. I think what you're talking about is how do we foster a culture, not either or, but all the above to what we're saying, which makes it so complex.
Right.
There's a great comment around employee assistance programs. I think we have one. It's amazing. I think we have to continue to demystify in a very intentional way that you're not in trouble or broken to access an employee assistance program. And I'm hoping that we can continue to build that coming out of this pandemic.
Yeah, wonderful. We're going to go back just towards the end, and if people we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, one of which has been answered. So if there are other questions the audience wants to ask, please put them in there at the moment. But just to go back to that initial quote from that Netflix for Educators article, and so what is going to be needed for us to actually start to help educators and leaders, and also to start to change our systems? And I suppose really what we're changing is, again, some of those mindsets of, yes, it's good to get help and support and coaching. Yes, I need to take care of myself as a school leader. And also, yes, that some of these well-intended but superficial activities don't really make a significant difference. So I'll open this up to anybody. Dennis is raising his physical hand.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And I'd also like to thank Pasquale in London and Jenna in Los Angeles for their questions. Pasquale asked about the role of the community, well-being, and Jenna asked about a sense of belonging. And I like these arguments that kind of like broaden us beyond the kind of granular level of what happens in the classroom. In the end, our teachers are not therapists, and we should not try and turn them into therapists, I suggest. Teachers have a very difficult job of transmitting kind of very esoteric realms of knowledge like mathematics and chemistry and physics to a rising generation. And the strange thing that we do in schools a lot is we kind of take that knowledge and we kind of reify it, we kind of freeze it, and then ask the students to spit it back to us on our tests and on our assessments. And, you know, it's really interesting to, it's a fascinating process to write books with Andy Hargreaves. I would just have to say, absolutely fascinating, because we explore so many broad ranges of literature, but we also think back on our own lives. And Andy and I were both products of public school systems, you know, he in the UK, me in the US, in Virginia. And, you know, it's kind of amazing that we can look back and we can identify some incredibly magical moments in our educations where the teaching simply sparkled and we came alive as learners, and we thought, if this is what school is, this is what I want. If this is what learning is, then bring it on. And what I do hope that sometimes our coaches and our professional support groups and university partners can help with is that there's so much tacit knowledge in our profession, so much tacit knowledge that we have difficulty going back and retrieving. And if we could kind of think about those practices, think about those moments where as learners we became fully engaged, whether we were students or whether we were teachers, that I think can really help us to push beyond the pandemic. So Andy and I did become cautious in writing the book. There is something called, you know, where everything in society should be solved by more therapists. And I don't think we really want to go there in our schools, because that tends to neglect the rich social environment of the classroom, and it neglects the whole community support that's around. So if we can, you know, thread the needle, we will stay true to education, to learning about this amazing, fragile, and vulnerable world and our place in it. And in the process of learning about that world, with all of its difficulty, with all those challenges, we'll get to a deep sense of fulfillment. And well-being is certainly a big part of that.
You know, we've one kind of fun activity that we did, we brought together some folks, both from the community and from our schools. And we just asked that question around, so how can we foster belongingness over the summertime? Especially as we leave this, right? And knowing that, you know, kids have become connected in a variety of ways. I think leaders can just start there with a freedom of not having all the answers. The activities that were created, you know, everything from let's have art kits that kids and staff can go and take, you know, under themes around street art, sidewalk art, and then take pictures and digitize them and then have a connectedness, to let's all let a balloon go at the same time. I think what we have to do is let go of the, well, it's gonna be this, and overthink sometimes. Sometimes just by raising the question and holding the spot like you're doing today, people can feel like connectivity and a belongingness. And how do we create a culture that there's a phrase that says there are certain questions that have no right to go away, right? Is it best for kids? Are our kids connected? Do we feel belonged? That's not a proper way to say that, but you get my point, right? And I think that's one thing that I hope today folks can just walk away with today is you're not alone. You're here today with us. you're not alone with your own struggles. Find one other person to connect with, raise that question around what does it mean for kids to be belonging? How can we facilitate that?
Exactly. As always, we're going to run out of time. We're up to the last 60 seconds already of this webinar, and we probably could go on for another half hour or hour. But I want to thank our panelists for the engaging conversation. I'm definitely going to look out for both of the books, Andy and Dennis, the one that comes out tomorrow, I believe. Is that right, Dennis?
Day after tomorrow.
Okay, day after tomorrow. But also the one on well-being coming out later in the year. I'll definitely keep an eye out for the amazing work that you continue to do in Tacoma, Josh. I think you were an EdWeek educator to learn from back in 2015, and I think that sort of mantle continues, into 2021 and continued. But I also want to ask people to have a look at the work that's going on up in Canada that Tara has been heading around well-being, because that is starting to see some progress around changing mindsets, people taking this a little bit more seriously for their own well-being, but also that of their schools, and also in a way that is both supportive but also fairly anonymous as well at the same time. So I want to thank everybody for their thoughts and their time today. Before I completely sign off, this is the first of our webinars. The next one, which is coming up on the 29th of June, is looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, you can sign up at that landing page, BTS Spark Summer Series. You can also follow us on Twitter, obviously, as well. The DEI conversation, we'll be looking at some of the issues that were raised today by both Andy and Josh as well, about underserved communities. But we also, and we have Shante Garrett, who is superintendent from North Carolina, speaking on around that. But we also have Peter DeWitt from EdWeek talking about LGBTQ inclusion as well, and our own Victoria Rodriguez, who has been heading some of our DEI work at BTS Spark. So please join us for that. And I thank you all for your time and hope you have a fruitful and enjoyable rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.